Chapter 23. The floorboards creaked beneath Rory's feet as he crept through the darkened hallway of Deirdre's cottage. His heart thundered in his chest, each beat a reminder of the perilous task ahead. The sword of Nuada, wrapped carefully in an old blanket, weighed heavily in his arms. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Rory paused at the door to the guest room, where John and Henry slept. He could hear John's soft snores, a sound that usually brought him comfort. Now, it only served to twist the knife of guilt in his gut. "I'm sorry, lads," Rory whispered, his voice barely audible even to his own ears. "But I can't risk your lives any further. This is my burden to bear." With a deep breath, Rory turned away from the door and made his way to the cottage's entrance. Each step felt like a betrayal, but he steeled himself against the doubt gnawing at his insides. This was the only way to ensure Thelma's safety. He had to believe that. The night air hit him like a slap to the face as he stepped outside. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and sea salt. Rory pulled his coat tighter around himself, clutching the sword to his chest like a lifeline. As he made his way down the winding path that led away from Deirdre's cottage, Rory's mind raced with memories of the past few days. The terror of Thelma's kidnapping, the frantic search, the discovery of the sword. It all seemed like a fever dream now, too fantastical to be real. But the weight in his arms was real enough, as was the fear that clenched his heart at the thought of facing Luther Deegan alone. Rory shook his head, trying to clear the doubts from his mind. He'd made his decision. There was no turning back now. The streets of the small town were deserted at this hour, the only sound the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. Rory stuck to the shadows, avoiding the pools of light cast by the few street lamps still burning. He couldn't risk being seen, not when so much was at stake. As he walked, Rory rehearsed what he would say to Luther, how he would negotiate Thelma's safe return. But every scenario he imagined ended in disaster. Luther wasn't a man known for his mercy or his honesty. What if this was all a trap? Rory's steps faltered as a new thought struck him. What if Thelma was already... No. He couldn't allow himself to think that way. She was alive. She had to be. The silhouette of Castle Macduff loomed before him, a dark blot against the star-strewn sky. Rory paused at the base of the hill, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. This was it. The moment of truth. "Lord," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the castle. "If you're listening, I could use a bit of divine intervention right about now." But there was no answer, save for the howling of the wind. With a sigh, Rory began the climb up to the castle. John Walker's eyes snapped open, his soldier's instincts screaming that something was wrong. The room was dark and quiet, but there was a tension in the air that he couldn't quite place. He sat up slowly, his hand automatically reaching for the gun he kept under his pillow. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he scanned the room. Henry was still asleep in the other bed, his soft snores filling the air. But Rory's bed was empty, the covers thrown back haphazardly. "Dang it, Rory," John muttered, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "What have you done now?" Moving as quietly as he could, John dressed quickly. His mind raced with possibilities, each more dire than the last. Had Rory been taken? Had he gone off on his own to face Luther? The latter seemed more likely, given what John knew of Rory's stubborn nature. The fool probably thought he was protecting them by going alone. John checked his gun, making sure it was loaded. He wouldn't be caught unprepared, not this time. As he made his way to the door, he paused, considering whether to wake Henry. But no, speed was of the essence now. He'd leave a note, in case things went south. John scribbled a hasty message on a scrap of paper, leaving it on the nightstand where Henry would be sure to see it. Then, with one last glance at his sleeping companion, he slipped out of the room. The cottage was silent as John made his way to the front door. He could hear Deirdre's soft breathing from her room, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding under her roof. He looked to the side of the door and saw a set of car keys hanging on a wooden rack. John quickly scooped them up and exited the door. Outside, the night air was crisp and cold. John took a deep breath, letting it clear his head. Now, which way would Rory have gone? The answer came to him almost immediately. Castle Macduff. It was the most likely place for a clandestine meeting, and it had a history with both Rory and Luther. Without further hesitation, John unlocked and jumped into Deirdre's car. "I sure hope she doesn't mind me borrowing her car." John muttered under his breath. He only hoped he wasn't too late. The ancient stones of Castle Macduff loomed before Rory, their weathered faces seeming to mock him with the weight of centuries. How many men, he wondered, had come to this place seeking their fate? How many had found only ruin and despair? Rory shook off the morbid thoughts, focusing instead on the task at hand. He had to find Luther, had to make the exchange. Thelma's life depended on it. The castle's great oak door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning him inside. Rory hesitated, his hand tightening on the wrapped sword. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to run as far and as fast as he could. But Thelma's face flashed in his mind, her smile, her laugh, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her latest historical discovery. He couldn't abandon her. Not now. Not ever. With a deep breath, Rory pushed the door open and stepped into the darkness of Castle Macduff. The air inside was stale and musty, thick with the scent of decay and forgotten memories. Rory's footsteps echoed in the cavernous entrance hall, each sound seeming to announce his presence to whatever lurked in the shadows. "Luther?" he called out, his voice sounding small and uncertain in the vast space. "I'm here. I've brought what you asked for." For a long moment there was no response. Then, from somewhere deeper in the castle, came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. "Ah, Rory." Luther's voice drifted to him, smooth as silk and cold as ice. "I was beginning to think you might not show. How good of you to join us." Rory's blood ran cold at the word us. He wasn't alone. Of course he wasn't alone. How could Rory have been so naive? "Where's Thelma?" Rory demanded, trying to keep the fear from his voice. "I want to see her before we make any exchange." Luther's laugh echoed through the hall, a sound devoid of any real mirth. "All in good time, my boy. All in good time. Why don't you come join me in the great hall? We have much to discuss." Rory hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to flee. But he had come too far to turn back now. With a silent prayer for strength, he began to make his way deeper into the castle, towards whatever fate awaited him. The great hall of Castle Macduff loomed before Rory, its cavernous expanse a testament to centuries past. Moonlight filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows across the stone floor. At the far end of the hall, Luther Deegan stood waiting, a smug smile playing across his lips. Rory's grip tightened on the wrapped sword as he approached, each step echoing in the vast space. The weight of the ancient weapon seemed to increase with every passing moment, as if it sensed the gravity of what was about to transpire. "Ah, Rory," Luther's voice rang out, smooth as silk and cold as ice. "I must admit, I had my doubts about whether you'd actually show up. But here you are, ever the doting father." Rory gritted his teeth, fighting back the urge to lash out. "Where's Thelma?" he demanded, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "I want to see her before we do this." Luther's smile widened, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "All in good time, my boy. All in good time. First, let's see what you've brought me, shall we?" He held out his hand expectantly, and Rory felt a chill run down his spine. Every instinct screamed at him to turn and run, to keep the sword as far from Luther's grasp as possible. But Thelma's face flashed in his mind, and he knew he had no choice. With trembling hands, Rory began to unwrap the sword. The ancient blade seemed to glow in the moonlight, its intricate etchings coming alive before their eyes. Luther's breath caught audibly, his composure slipping for just a moment. "The sword of Nuada," he breathed, reverence and greed warring in his voice. "After all these years..." Rory held the sword out, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure Luther must be able to hear it. "Take it," he said, his voice hoarse. "Now where's my daughter?" Luther's eyes never left the sword as he reached out to take it. The moment his fingers closed around the hilt, a change came over him. His back straightened, his eyes gleamed with an unnatural light. Power seemed to radiate from him in palpable waves. "Oh, Rory," Luther said, his voice tinged with something that might have been pity, if not for the cruel twist of his lips. "Did you really think it would be that simple?" Before Rory could react, Luther raised his free hand and snapped his fingers. The sound echoed through the hall like a gunshot, and suddenly Rory found himself surrounded, Men melted out of the shadows, their faces grim and their weapons at the ready. "What is this?" Rory demanded, his eyes darting from one threat to another. "We had a deal, Luther. Where's Thelma?" Luther laughed, the sound bouncing off the stone walls. "Oh, my dear boy, Thelma is long gone. Did you really think I'd keep her around once I knew you were coming with the sword? No, I'm afraid you've been played for a fool." Rory's world tilted on its axis. Thelma was gone? But where? Was she safe? Or had Luther done something terrible to her? His mind raced with possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. "No," Rory growled, his hands clenching into fists. "If you've hurt her, I swear I'll—" "You'll what?" Luther interrupted, his tone mocking. "You're in no position to make threats, Rory. In fact, you're in no position to do much of anything anymore." With another snap of his fingers, Luther's men moved in. Rory fought back with all the strength and skill he possessed, but he was hopelessly outnumbered. Fists rained down on him from all sides, and he tasted blood as a particularly vicious blow caught him across the jaw. Through the haze of pain and confusion, Rory heard Luther speaking again. "Take him to the caves. Make sure he's secure. We wouldn't want our guest of honor missing out on the festivities to come." Rough hands seized Rory, dragging him towards a dark opening in the far wall. He struggled against their grip, his mind reeling. The caves? What caves? As they descended into the darkness, the air grew damp and cold. The sounds of their footsteps echoed strangely, giving Rory the impression of vast, unseen spaces all around them. How long they walked, he couldn't say. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the oppressive blackness. Finally they came to a stop. There was the sound of metal scraping against stone, and then Rory was being shoved forward. He stumbled, nearly falling, and found himself in some kind of enclosure. A cage, he realized with growing horror. "Welcome to your new home, Rory." Luther's voice drifted to him from somewhere in the darkness. "I do hope you'll find it comfortable. You'll be spending quite a bit of time here, after all." The cage door clanged shut, the sound of the lock engaging like a death knell in the cavernous space. Rory threw himself against the bars, his hands grasping futilely at the unyielding metal. "Luther," he shouted, his voice echoing in the darkness. "You can't do this. What about Thelma? What have you done with her?" But there was no answer save for the sound of retreating footsteps. Rory slumped to the floor of his prison, his mind reeling. How had it all gone so wrong? And what of Thelma? Was she truly safe, or had Luther been lying about that too? As the darkness closed in around him, Rory felt the weight of his failure pressing down on him like a physical thing. He had given up the sword, endangered himself and his friends, and for what? He was no closer to saving Thelma than he had been before. In the depths below Castle Macduff, surrounded by stone and shadow, Rory McDuffie closed his eyes and prayed for a miracle. John crouched in the shadows of Castle Macduff, his breath coming in short, controlled bursts. The night air was thick with the scent of damp stone and something else. Something old and musty, like forgotten secrets. He'd followed Rory's trail here, cursing the younger man's foolishness with every step. "Bloody idiot," John muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the courtyard for any sign of movement. What was he thinking, coming here alone? But John knew exactly what Rory had been thinking. The lad would do anything to save Thelma, even if it meant walking straight into Luther's trap. It was admirable, in a way. Stupid, but admirable. A flicker of movement caught John's eye. Two of Luther's men, dragging something, no, someone, between them. John's heart clenched as he recognized Rory's limp form as they drug Rory out the doorway and down a path away from the castle. "Oh no," he breathed, his hand instinctively tightening on the grip of his pistol. He wanted nothing more than to charge in, guns blazing, but years of military training held him back. He needed a plan. Taking a deep breath, John began to move. He kept low, using the shadows as cover, his footsteps silent on the damp grass. Years of training and combat experience guided his movements, making him all but invisible in the darkness. As he reached the path, John paused, listening intently. No sound of approaching footsteps, no voices, just the whisper of the wind through the ancient stones of the castle. With one last glance over his shoulder, John moved once more. The path was muddy and slick in places. John followed the two henchmen, making sure to keep his distance. John moved cautiously, every sense on high alert. The moonlight flickered in places, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance and writhe in the corners of his vision. John lost sight of the guards and Rory. "Where are you, Rory?" John muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He strained his ears, hoping to catch some sound, some clue as to where they might have taken his friend. A muffled shout from somewhere below made John freeze. It was faint but unmistakable, Rory's voice. Without hesitation, John began to move towards the sound, his pace quickening. He found a narrow path leading down over the cliff, the walkway worn smooth by centuries of use. The air grew cooler as he descended, the smell of damp stone stronger. Caves, John realized. There must be a network of caves beneath the castle. At the bottom of the walkway, John found himself in a wide cavern. Torches flickered on the walls, illuminating a scene that made his blood run cold. Rory was there, locked in a cage like some kind of animal. And there was Luther, standing before him with a sword in his hand. A sword that seemed to glow with an inner light. John's military training took over. He assessed the situation in a matter of seconds. 5 men, including Luther, all armed. Rory trapped and helpless. The odds weren't good, but John had faced worse. Moving with the fluid grace of a trained fighter, John struck. His first shot took Luther's nearest man in the shoulder, spinning him around with a cry of pain. The second shot went wide, as John was forced to dive for cover behind a rocky outcropping. "Well, well," Luther's voice rang out, calm and amused. "It seems we have another guest. How delightful." John gritted his teeth, risking a quick glance around his cover. Luther stood there, seemingly unconcerned, that dang sword still glowing in his hand. His remaining men had taken up defensive positions, their guns trained on John's hiding spot. "Give it up, Luther," John shouted. "You're not getting out of here with that sword." Luther's laugh echoed off the cavern walls. "Oh, I think I am, and I think you'll be joining your friend here very shortly." John's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but he'd be dipped if he was going to give up without a fight. With a roar of defiance, John burst from his cover, firing as he moved. One of Luther's men went down, clutching his leg. Another cried out as a bullet grazed his arm. But then, John's gun clicked empty, and he knew he was in trouble. The blow came from behind, a crushing impact that sent John sprawling to the ground. His vision swam, the cavern spinning around him. He tried to push himself up, but his arms wouldn't cooperate. A valiant effort. Luther's voice drifted to him, sounding distant and distorted, but ultimately futile. Rough hands seized John, dragging him to his feet. Through blurry eyes he saw Luther approach, that awful smirk still on his face. "Lock him up with the other one," Luther commanded. "I want them both to witness what's to come." John struggled weakly as he was hauled across the cavern and shoved unceremoniously into a cage next to Rory's. The lock clicked shut with a sound of finality. As Luther and his men retreated, their laughter echoing off the stone walls, John slumped against the bars of his cage. He turned to Rory, seeing his own fear and frustration mirrored in the younger man's eyes. "Well," John said, his voice rough with pain and exhaustion, "this isn't quite how I imagined the rescue going." Rory let out a humorless chuckle. "I'm sorry, John. This is all my fault. I never should have come here alone." John waved off the apology. "Save it, lad. What's done is done. Now we need to focus on getting out of here." They lapsed into silence, each lost in their own thoughts. John's mind raced, considering and discarding plans. The situation seemed hopeless, but he'd be damned if he was going to give up. John Walker's fingers worked deftly at the lock of his cage, the small piece of wire he'd managed to conceal, feeling like salvation in his hands. The darkness of the cave pressed in around him, broken only by the faint flicker of distant torchlight. Every sound echoed ominously, and John found himself holding his breath, straining to distinguish between the normal creaks and groans of the ancient stone and the potential approach of Luther's men. The lock finally gave way with a soft click that sounded thunderous in the silence. John froze, his heart pounding in his chest as he waited for the alarm to be raised. But no shouts came, no running footsteps, only the steady drip of water from somewhere in the depths of the cave. "Rory," John whispered, his voice barely audible even to his own ears. "I'm out. I'm going to get help." From the neighbouring cage, Rory's face appeared, pale and drawn in the dim light. "Be careful, John. Luther's men are everywhere." John nodded grimly. "I've faced worse odds. You just sit tight and be ready to move when I get back." With one last glance at his imprisoned friend, John slipped out of the cage and into the shadows of the cave. Years of military training kicked in, guiding his movements as he crept along the damp stone walls. Every step was carefully placed, every breath measured and controlled. The cave system was a maze of twisting tunnels and sudden drops. More than once, John found himself at a dead end, forced to backtrack and try another route. The air grew thinner as he moved deeper into the mountain, and a chill settled into his bones that had nothing to do with the temperature. As he rounded a corner, voices drifted to him from up ahead. John pressed himself against the wall, barely daring to breathe as two of Luther's men passed by, their conversation echoing off the stone walls. "Don't see why we have to keep watch down here," one was saying, his voice gruff with irritation. "It's not like they're going anywhere." His companion laughed, a harsh sound in the stillness of the cave. "Boss's orders. You want to be the one to tell him we left the prisoners unguarded?" The voices faded as the men moved away, and John allowed himself a small sigh of relief. He waited a few more moments to ensure they were truly gone before continuing on his way. After what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, John finally saw a glimmer of moonlight ahead. The cave mouth loomed before him, a portal back to the world above. But as he approached, a new problem presented itself. Two more of Luther's men stood guard at the entrance, their silhouettes stark against the night sky. John's mind raced, considering and discarding plans. He couldn't risk a confrontation. The noise would surely alert others to his escape. But he couldn't go back either, not when freedom was so close. A memory surfaced then, of a trick he'd learned long ago in the trenches of the Great War. With careful movements, John picked up a small stone from the cave floor. He weighed it in his hand for a moment, gauging the distance, then threw it with all his might deeper into the cave. The stone clattered against the far wall, the sound echoing and multiplying until it seemed like a whole avalanche was descending upon them. The guards reacted instantly, both turning towards the noise with weapons drawn. "What was that?" one hissed, his voice tight with fear. "I don't know," the other replied. "We'd better check it out. The boss'll have our hides if something's gone wrong." As the guards moved into the cave, John seized his chance. He darted forward, keeping low to the ground, and slipped out into the night. The cool air hit him like a physical force after the stifling atmosphere of the cave, and for a moment he simply stood there, gulping in great lungfuls of it. But there was no time to savor his freedom. John set off at a brisk pace, his mind already racing ahead to the next stage of his plan. He had to get to Deirdre, had to convince her to help. It was their only chance of getting Rory out alive. The night air invigorated John as he made his way through the shadowy landscape surrounding Castle Macduff. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig under his feet, sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system. He couldn't afford to be caught now, not when Rory's life hung in the balance. Up the path and past the castle, John ran to Deirdre's car, jumped in and tore off down the road back to their safe house. As he approached the safe house where they had left Deirdre and Henry, John's mind raced with possible scenarios. How would he explain the situation? Would she even believe him? And more importantly, would she be willing to risk her life to help them? John reached the cottage and paused, listening intently for any sign of movement inside. A faint light flickered behind the curtains. Deirdre must have woken up. Taking a deep breath, he rapped sharply on the door. "Deirdre," he called, his voice low but urgent. "It's John. Open up quickly." For a heart-stopping moment, there was no response. Then the sound of hurried footsteps, and the door swung open to reveal Deirdre, her red hair disheveled and her eyes wide with alarm. "John," she gasped. "What on earth?" No time to explain. John cut her off, pushing past her into the cottage. "Rory's in trouble. We need your help." Deirdre's face paled, but to her credit, she didn't waste time with questions. "What do you need me to do?" John quickly outlined the situation: Rory's capture, the caves beneath Castle Macduff, and their desperate need for someone who knew the layout. As he spoke, Deirdre's expression shifted from shock to determination. The old smugglers' tunnels, she murmured, almost to herself. I always thought they were just stories, but they're real, John finished for her, and they might be our only chance of getting Rory out alive. Deirdre nodded, her jaw set in a firm line. Give me 2 minutes to grab some things. We'll need supplies if we're going into those caves. By this time, Henry had woken up, his hair one giant cotton ball. He scratched his head and then out the bed. He quickly started throwing his clothes on. As Deirdre bustled about the cottage, gathering supplies and pulling on sturdier shoes, John found himself marveling at her composure. He'd expected resistance, fear, maybe even outright refusal. But Deirdre seemed to have taken the situation in stride, as if daring rescues were an everyday occurrence for her. Ready, Deirdre announced, hefting a small backpack onto her shoulders. Me too, Henry chimed in. Let's go save our friend, Deirdre said. In the car, they set off into the night, John driving back towards Castle Macduff. As they drove, Deirdre peppered him with questions about the layout of the caves, the number of guards, and the exact location where Rory was being held. The stories always said there were dozens of entrances to the tunnels, Deirdre mused as they approached the looming silhouette of the castle. Hidden all over the countryside. If we can find one, we might be able to bypass Luther's men entirely. John nodded, hope flaring in his chest. Any idea where we might find one of these entrances? Deirdre's brow furrowed in concentration. There was always talk of a hollow tree, not far from the castle grounds. It was said to conceal a passage straight into the heart of the cave system. It took them nearly an hour of searching in the dark, but finally they found it. An ancient oak, its trunk gnarled and twisted with age. At its base, partially hidden by overgrown roots, was a small opening barely large enough for a man to squeeze through. This is it, Deirdre whispered, her eyes shining with excitement. The entrance to the smugglers' tunnels. John eyed the dark hole dubiously. You're sure about this? Deirdre shot him a look that was equal parts amusement and exasperation. Do you have a better idea? With a sigh, John conceded the point. Ladies first, he said, gesturing towards the opening. Deirdre rolled her eyes but didn't argue. She pulled a small torch from her backpack, flicked it on, and began to lower herself into the hole. John followed close behind, his body tense and ready for action. Henry went through last. The tunnel was narrow and damp, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. They moved slowly at first, Deirdre's torch casting eerie shadows on the rough-hewn walls. But as they progressed deeper into the mountain, Deirdre's steps grew more confident. It's just like in the stories, she murmured, her voice filled with wonder. Every twist, every turn, it's all here. John marveled at her ability to navigate the labyrinthine passages. Where he saw only an endless maze of identical tunnels, Deirdre seemed to read the very stones themselves, guiding them unerringly towards their goal. As they rounded yet another bend, John suddenly held up a hand, signaling for silence. In the distance, he could hear voices, Luther's men, patrolling the main caverns. We're close, he whispered to Deirdre. The cages where they're holding Rory should be just ahead. Deirdre nodded, her face set with determination. There should be a side passage coming up on our left. If the stories are right, it'll lead us right to where we need to be. Sure enough, a narrow opening soon appeared in the left wall of the tunnel. Henry squeezed through first, then John wincing as the rough stones scraped against his skin. But any discomfort was forgotten as they emerged into a larger cavern, and John caught sight of a familiar figure behind the bars of a cage. Rory, he breathed, relief washing over him. Rory's head snapped up, his eyes widening in disbelief as he saw John and Deirdre approaching. How in the world? No time to explain, John cut him off, already working on the lock of the cage. We need to get you out of here before Luther realizes what's happening. As the lock finally gave way and Rory stepped out of the cage, John allowed himself a moment of triumph. They had done it. Against all odds, they had rescued their friend, but their celebration was short-lived. From somewhere in the depths of the cave system came a shout of alarm, followed by the sound of running feet. They must have heard us, Deirdre said, her voice tight with fear. We need to move, now. As they raced back towards the secret tunnel, John's mind was already racing ahead, planning their next move. They had rescued Rory, yes, but they were far from safe. Luther still had the sword, and as long as that was the case, none of them could truly rest easy. But for now, escape was their priority. Everything else would have to wait. As they plunged back into the narrow confines of the smuggler's tunnel, John sent up a silent prayer of thanks. They had overcome impossible odds once today. With any luck, they would do so again.